Thank you everyone for joining us today for a wrap up of the OysterWatch project phase 2. To make a start, I would first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I am speaking to you from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which each of you are living, working and learning from today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, I'm just giving a bit of a rundown of how the afternoon's going to progress. We probably won't go till 6 o'clock, but just we want to make sure there was enough time to have a bit of a chat and some questions at the end. So to start off with, we'll just do a quick introduction of who we are. And then I'm going to go over the project background and experimental design for those of you that aren't as familiar with OysterWatch. We'll talk about how our citizen scientists were involved in the project, what they actually found, and then I'll switch over to Simon Brannigan from TNC, who will talk about how the data is being used, where to next for their broader reef restoration efforts, and then we'll have a follow-up Q&A session and bring it to the close. Just again, that this session is being recorded, so again, if you don't want to be seen on the recording, please just make sure that your video is off. We will have some time for questions. If you've got a question that you can think of whilst one of us is presenting, feel free to type it in the chat. We do have Cade Mills from ReefWatch here, and he's keeping an eye on questions, and he'll be able to pass those on to us at the end. So, just a quick introduction for those of you that aren't very familiar with the organisation. My name's Nicole Mertens. I'm a ReefWatch Project Officer with the Victorian National Parks Association. So I've got a little bit of detail about the organisation up on the screen now for you. Essentially, ReefWatch is the Victorian National Parks Association Marine Citizen Science Program, and my role is that I do coordinate several citizen science projects that we run, and we like to basically just give people an opportunity to get out into nature and learn a bit more about their marine environment, but also contribute some data that is actually useful going forward. So that's really what underpins OysterWatch. And I don't know whether you can see Cade Mills, but Cade is also here as the ReefWatch coordinator. And we've also got Simon Brannigan joining us today from the Nature Conservancy, who partnered up with us on OysterWatch. So it may surprise some of you here today that Port Phillip Bay used to be home to vast tracts of oyster reefs and mussel beds. Now these filter feeders provide valuable ecosystem services for us, like improving water quality, stabilising sediments, protecting coasts from erosion and storm events, and also providing habitat for many fish species. They're also part of the diet of coastal Aboriginal people, as well as those of European settlers. However, overfishing in early colonial days, so say like the 1840s through to about the 1860s, pretty much depleted those oyster reefs. And later, some scallop and mussel dredging in sort of the 1960s through to about the 1990s essentially also wiped out the remaining mussel beds that were there. So what I've got up on the screen now is just an excerpt from this scientific paper that's up, where Hamer and Ford actually looked at how do we work out historically where our shellfish actually settled and were moving around the bay. They used a lot of historical and contemporary literature to try and work that out. They had interviews with fishermen, because some people do have living memories of big mussel beds just right up on the shore that you could walk out to. And yeah, so gathering that kind of data, looking at catch data and also their own personal observations. And they came up with an estimate that about 50% of the bay was covered in shellfish reefs or beds. And realistically, about 95% of that has been lost today. Now, there are still some small pockets of shellfish. Checking out this little photo here of some oysters on a kind of just a little bit of rock sitting out by itself. Same with mussels in and around the shallower parts of the bay. But especially in the case of oysters, we consider them to be functionally extinct. So they're not providing that ecosystem service that I talked about. This actually reflects a worldwide trend in terms of shellfish loss. But fortunately, work is now being taken all around the world and in Australia to restore these systems and also the benefits that they provide us. So I will leave it up to Simon to talk more in detail about the work that the Nature Conservancy has done and are planning to do on the broader reef restoration, which is actually just physically putting those reefs out there. And you can also check out the link at the bottom there to see what TNC is doing. But as you can see from this photo, I think reef restoration is a pretty resource and time intensive undertaking. So you really want to be sure that you're getting the most bang for your buck when you're choosing the sites to start building your artificial reef or rebuilding a reef that was there. So that's where OysterWatch comes in. Looking at kind of that historical data again, you get a pretty good idea where there was a lot of oysters and mussels, which is sort of up in the Geelong Arm and kind of at the north part of the bay. Coincidentally or not so coincidentally, that's also where TNC has actually started rebuilding some reefs. So that's a good start, but they obviously want to expand on this project, and that's kind of where we come in, because we want to look at what happens with the juvenile shellfish, which are actually a free swimming organisms for both the mussels and the oysters. They will actually move around the bay, and there's a lot of factors that might influence that. So we're really interested in finding out how they're moving around the bay today, not just historically, and also where they're settling now. So after the success of a pilot phase of the project, where we did end up having monitoring sites at 6 locations around the bay, we once again deployed our monitoring units at 6 sites within the bay in 2018. And then we added to those sites additional 4 sites in 2019. And the Nature Conservancy has also got monitoring at their reef restoration sites. So combined with other tools such as DNA analysis and of the water column, we were really hoping that our results would give us an insight into really how they're moving through the bay, these juvenile blue mussels and also the native Angazi oysters, and help create a map of the hotspots of where these high numbers of juveniles were coming in each year. Now, I thought I'd take a couple of steps back and explain what the settlement units actually are, as I'm going to be referring to them a fair bit. The original idea was actually conceived by Kim Wright of Marine Care Ricketts Point, who I believe is with us today. Hi, Kim. And he was actually, as it turned out, really interested in what was going on with the shellfish in the bay as well. So he kind of started coming up with this on his own accord, and then we all teamed up and really benefited from his expertise and trial and error here. So Kim and his friends actually did trial a few different designs in the field. Here's a photo of one of them. And they mainly consisted of these PVC plates that the juvenile shellfish can just land on and grow. So one of the earlier designs here was a stack of just multi-directional plates anchored to the substrate with like a dive weight. And unfortunately, it did not survive rough conditions. So they had to come up with a design that would detect the differences in where and how the shellfish were actually settling, but also be able to stay in place for quite a while and be able to withstand those like really rough conditions that we get in the bay. So eventually they did settle on this idea of like 2 plate sandwiches, as you can see, attached to a concrete block by PVC pipes at different heights. This in theory allows us to test for the effect of height of the water column, because we know that oysters in particular can be sensitive to sedimentation, as well as testing whether the oysters settled or survived at higher rates on, say, the different surfaces, so whether it's facing up or facing down. So this block setup was a success. We've continued using it throughout the pilot phase, and we're using it in phase 2 as well. So thanks again, Kim. Here is an example of the units in place at Blackgowrie. And as you can see, we have a line of units just set up in a row so that our divers could work out where they are and get to them easily. So all in all, it gives us 6 units deployed each site, 12 plate sandwiches per site, or 48 plate surfaces, plus a vertical surface made of a PVC divider kind of holding the 2 plates together at each site. So lots of areas for the oysters and the mussels to grow on. And this is kind of just a bit of an indication of what everything looks like in the field. So when I'm talking about these things, when I go through our results, this is what we're talking about when we talk about a plate sandwich. So we had them at a high height, we had them at a low height, and then depending on which way the surface of the plate is actually facing, we also had a look at what was growing on either side. Now the units were deployed and stayed in the field the whole time, but we did effectively rotate through plate sandwiches. So we did a deployment at sort of the start of the oyster spawning season in October each year. We retrieved those plates after about 3 months, and at the same time we put out a new set of plates to have a look for another 3 months. So, we've got an eye up there that shouldn't be there, but just wanted to go over what our OysterWatchers actually did. So aside from effectively coming up with the experimental design, we had people involved in constructing both the units and all of the plates, and we're talking hundreds and hundreds of plate sandwiches. They actually put all of the units in the field and went out and collected and redeployed using various methods, mostly diving. But in some places it wasn't a simple task as just to jump off a pier, and we had to use boats and even little kayaks from time to time. While they were out in the field, our OysterWatchers also monitored the plates to make sure that the units still held up in rough conditions and that we didn't have any major issues or didn't lose too many when we had storms. They also did a lot of the actual recording and measuring of the oysters and the mussels that landed on those cinema plates when it came to retrieve them. They added a lot of that data onto our computer and into our spreadsheets, and they also actually did a little bit of the analysis. So what I'm really proud of, I guess, is that our OysterWatchers, our citizen scientists, were involved every step of the way, and that's a pretty significant thing, and I'm very grateful to everybody for the amount of work that they put into that project. So I just wanted to go through just some happy snaps of some of the people involved and some of the activities. So this is that construction phase. So they were kind of like the hard yakka days. They were the ones where we had to use a bunch of power tools and glue and lots and lots and lots of zip ties and put everything together. Here's an example of somebody actually threading together the plate sandwiches, which is pretty fiddly in the end. But there were some pretty fun days, and I do appreciate this was a chance for a lot of people that maybe couldn't get involved in the in-water activities could actually help us out and make sure that, basically we had the gear to do the project. So thank you to everyone involved in that. We had the deployment dives and the retrieval dives. This is a little bit more of a niche thing because obviously you do have to be able to dive, and we had to make sure that we had qualified people supervising the dives. So smaller numbers of people, but still pretty enthusiastic. I've gone and picked photos that I guess, show things off at the best of times, but they weren't always sunny conditions. So I do again have to thank everybody who was involved, especially on those days where it really wasn't all that appealing to get in the water, but you still did it anyways. Thank you very much. This is a photo taken from the ABC in August last year. This is the end of Frankston Pier. So like I said, occasionally in the bay we do get some pretty rough conditions. August last year was one of those days. It actually washed a fair chunk of the pier away, and right under the tip of the pier, i.e. what you can see on your screens here, was actually where we had our Frankston sites units deployed. So unfortunately, we were not able to sample Frankston for the 2019-2020 season. But because things like this can occur, another really important task for our OysterWatchers was to actually go out occasionally and monitor their sites and make sure that the units were okay and report any damage to us so that we could make sure that we could get replacements or work around the issues if we could possibly work around them. And these are just some examples of one of the groups from Geelong, Australian Diving Instruction, actually making a bit of a thing about their monitoring dives as well as all their other OysterWatch activities. So I think I really like that too, is that there's a lot of enthusiasm from our groups about actually sharing the stories and looking at not just kind of the end result, but all of the little steps that get into it. So again, thanks to the groups that did that. And then obviously we have the big data collecting events, which is where we pull all the plates out of the water, we carefully take them apart, making sure that we've got everything the right way up. And we write down the corresponding numbers and sizes of both living and dead shellfish, so the oysters and the mussels, for each of those plate surfaces that we've got. So those are pretty big days. They're not very glamorous. They're not very nicely scented, and we get a lot of attention from the seagulls. So again, everybody that was involved in that aspect, thank you so much. And then our end result is that we had our little data sheets converted into an Excel spreadsheet because of course, and then eventually actually uploading to the Atlas of Living Australia. And this is a basically a place where you can put all this kind of data where it's available then for marine managers, interested members of the community, really anyone can get a hold of those records. So it's a really good step to take. And thanks for everybody who was involved in that one too. So to the exciting stuff, what did we find? So one thing that we did find was that we had significant variation in where and when we find the oysters in the bay. Our data does suggest that there's indeed great variation in those numbers, including also when this happens. So we tend to get more oysters settling on our units in the first half of the spawning season. That's roughly October to January. And then in the second half, which is kind of January to April. And we did find lower numbers of mussels overall, but there's still some variation in the sites. So what I'm showing you now is our overall total oyster abundance collected per site throughout the entire time. And then next to that is actually a hotspot map of the oysters, which was generated using that data. So looking at kind of the average oysters per deployment. And it paints the same picture. So as you can see, we've got quite a lot of oysters coming in at Frankston Pier, and that's even noting the fact that we did not have a sampling season for the 2019-2020 spawning season. So looking at similar for mussels, so even though we did have lower numbers, we're still getting a lot of mussels at Frankston, with pretty okay numbers down near like Mornington and places like Point Cook. Combining that together, that gives us a hotspot map of the combined populations of oysters and mussels. And what we're finding again is that kind of Frankston area and also around the Mornington part of the bay tends to be our hotspot for these shellfish. So that was one of the biggest things. I kind of addressed a lot of the questions we had at the start of the project, but we wanted to have a look a little bit more in detail for some of the other things that we found. We did find that, yeah, there were some differences in what was showing up when, and we did tend to find that round one had that larger occurrence of oysters in particular. I will note, just because it seems to be, you know, it's just 2020 guys, but round one in 2020, we did have a much lower recruitment than the other 2 years. Not really sure what's going on there. We could just chalk it up to 2020. It does seem to fit in line. I've been talking with a few people that are shellfish experts, and it does seem to be that some populations have these kind of boom and bust cycles where they have a couple of really good years and then a couple of not so good years. So that would be something worth looking at in the future. For the mussels, not as much variation, but we can, yeah, basically look at that. What else did we find? We found that in terms of the actual orientation of the settled shellfish, that the oysters were found facing away from the surface more than they were found facing up towards the surface. We found that they weren't really influenced by the height of the plate sandwich on the actual block. Height did appear to have an effect on the mussel recruitment, but we suspect that might actually be a bit of an artifact, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So looking at those graphs for the orientation of the oysters, what we get is, yeah, like a significant amount more facing towards the surface of the sediment, as opposed to facing up towards the top. We did have a small number on the PVC divider. It's worth noting that there's a lot less area on the dividers, which might explain some of that. But basically what this is indicating to us is that oysters do really like a bit of a three-dimensional surface, which is something that's quite handy to know if you're going to be building habitat for them to settle on. So with the orientation of the mussels, interestingly, not a lot of difference on the high blocks between whether or not they face the bottom or the surface. A little bit of difference on the lower blocks, maybe not enough to be significant. And the reason why I said it might be an artifact is because we're not so sure that we actually had enough difference between, say, like the plate sitting on the high part and the plate sitting on the low part. That really came down to just the practicality of trying to suspend something in the water column on a rigid pole. If you give it too much height, it actually just increase the damage and the likelihood that they would snap and you'd lose everything. So something that future groups might want to consider if they're really interested in looking at the effects of height, that they've got to try to figure out that balance of rigidity and strength versus making it a big enough difference in height to actually measure. And this is just a nice little summary for people that really like numbers. So I crunched the numbers, and total number of oysters, the Angazi oysters that people detected, was 1,286, and the total number of blue mussels was 610. So all in all, over 1,800 shellfish were counted by our OysterWatchers. So well done, everybody. And again, just want to go back to the fact that there were 64 individual citizen scientists from our 8 marine care groups, dive clubs and dive stores, as well as wanted to put a shout out to the guys from several angling and yachting clubs who allowed us to use their facilities during plate construction and also during our field work. So again, thank you so much for that. Here's some more happy snaps. What I do really love about this project, and it's been quite a privilege, is just working with some really amazing, really switched on marine care community members and divers who just really wanted to, I guess, give something back. And we really hope we provided that opportunity. And I'm looking forward to being able to switch over to Simon Brannigan, and he'll be able to talk about where to next and what your data is actually helping our conservation partners achieve. So again, thank you to all the groups involved. Thank you to Albert Park Yachting and Angling Club, Blackgarry Yacht Squadron, and Beaumaris Yacht Club for allowing us to use your facilities. If you want to learn more about the project, you can check out the website here. And just wanted to also say thank you to the Victorian Government because OysterWatch was supported by the Port Phillip Bay Fund. So that's actually it from me. If anyone has any specific questions about the OysterWatch Citizen Science project for now, just check the chat.
Nicole,
Yes.
wondering if I could ask a question.
No worries.
Just in terms of a baseline, and I realise that's probably going to be virtually impossible, but you mentioned at the start of the presentation the flat oysters functionally extinct. So does that mean the recruitment you found on the plates was more than what you were expected? Was it less than what you expected? I was just trying to interpret how much you saw in terms of recruitment with the comment that the population is functionally extinct now.
Yeah, okay. So there's sort of two sources for the oysters, because not only were there kind of these pockets, and we're not really sure how much overall those are contributing, but we are also, TNC is seeding their reefs as well. I think I have to make Simon a co-host so he can actually jump in and have a chat about that.
That's okay. I'm
You there?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the shellfish reefs, the oyster reefs, the mussel reefs are functionally extinct as opposed to the individual oysters. So there's still sort of small dispersed pockets of the Angazi oysters, Australian flat oysters in the bay. Is it more than what we expected? That's a really good question, Pete. I guess Some of the areas, at least anecdotally, we hear from fishermen and the aquaculture farmers that they get quite a bit of natural recruitment on their gear, or on their gear, particularly when they're growing mussels. But yeah, probably, I guess we didn't really know. We didn't know how many oysters are left at Frankston, Ricketts Point, and a lot of the areas of the bay. So I guess you could say we're pleasantly surprised by some of the results, which is a really good sign in terms of future reef restoration.
Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. I do have one question.
Whether the shellfish was put back in the water after it was measured, or
yeah,
it could be.
yeah. So unfortunately, it was what we would call destructive sampling. So we had to actually remove the shellfish off the plates. We did put them back in the water afterwards, but yeah, mostly would have gone to food. And we do have one more question. Are you going to do more surveys? So we might put a pin in that one, and we'll come back to that one at the end. But yes, it is a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I might jump into it now, Nicole, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I guess with COVID-19, we've had to postpone our monitoring until sort of March, April next year, the monitoring that we do on the reef. So at this stage, we're thinking that we're going to postpone any further OysterWatch monitoring until sort of that October, November 2021 period. But if there's groups out there that are super keen, please get in contact and we'll see what we can do. But I guess we monitor the reefs using a different type of methodology every year. But in terms of OysterWatch, we're looking at postponing it. But yeah, like I said, please get in contact.
All right, and there is a question about whether or not the shellfish get pilfered. Now, Simon, I don't know whether you want to jump in on that one as well.
Do they get pilfered from the settlement plates? Probably not. From the reefs, not that we're aware of at this stage, but we'll continue to monitor those. Part of our monitoring is we look at, I guess, shellfish metrics, the number of oysters and mussels on the reef. Are they growing? Is the reef becoming self-sustaining over the time? Meaning that can it self-seed itself and grow in size and shape? We haven't seen any evidence of any harvesting off the reefs to date, but it is something of concern.
Yeah, and look, I would say that we didn't notice anything like that. We did actually have a lot of enthusiastic buy-in. We had a lot of people coming up talking to us from the fishing community as well, when we're on the piers wanting to know what's going on. So yeah, all in all, it's been a pretty positive experience for us. We do have one question about whether the photos of the recruitment tiles, so the settlement plates, were taken every monitoring session. Yes, they were. The question is whether there's a change in the other benthic organisms that we have. To be honest, that could be a project in and of itself. So we do actually have all of the plates that we took photos of from all of the sampling periods. If anyone is really interested in having a look, feel free to get in touch, because we can certainly provide those to have a look at what else is going on there. And oftentimes, yeah, there were a lot more other organisms attached to the plates apart from our shellfish.
I'm not sure if you covered this, Nicole, but all the data has gone up on the Atlas of Living Australia.
Yeah.
And Gidja, just in terms of any shellfish that we monitor from the actual reefs we're building goes back onto the reefs. So in terms of that process, we make sure they go back to as close as possible to where we collected them from.
Fantastic. Well, I do have one more thing before we move over to Simon, and that was just to check whether AJ Morton is online. I think he was going to give us a quick...
I'm here.
There you go. All right, AJ, you want to take over for a second?
Yeah, I just wanted to say from my perspective, being involved and getting stuck in the water, getting stuck into it in the water and being very active that way, that the amount of, I guess, educational opportunities and the general community, I guess, feel around being involved in citizen science with this particular project was fantastic. So I just wanted to make it a very public point to say I really wanted to thank you guys for creating projects like this, because like I said, the amount of flow on education and community involvement has been fantastic, and it really helps people engage more, not just to put a mask on and have a look at some stuff, but people nowadays want to get their hands dirty, and by getting in there and measuring things and counting things. So I just wanted to really say thank you to the Reef Watch and the TNC crew for putting this on and allowing us to contribute. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for all your hard work, AJ. All right, I think it's probably time for me to hand over to Simon so that he can share some exciting news about where to next.
Right. So, yeah, listen, this is pretty informal. So if you want to put through some questions through chat as I move along, you're more than welcome to, but we'll leave, what time is it? We'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions as well. I'd just like to say thank you for everyone for listening in on a Monday afternoon. That's very much appreciated. And thank you for all the citizen scientists who've contributed to this project. So as Nicole said earlier, I'm just going to cover off on how we're using the data in terms of selecting sites for shellfish reef restoration, and then take a bit of a deep dive into our construction plans that are happening very soon, actually in 2 to 3 weeks in October. And just a quick recap, Nicole showed this map previously, but essentially this shows the extent of shellfish reefs and mussel reefs in Port Phillip Bay back in the 1800s. As you can see, up to 50% of that bay was covered in patch shellfish reefs. And we have our existing sites, which I'll be talking about, is Wilson Spit. We've got a new site at 9 Foot Bank. We've got a site at Margaret's Reef. There's also a site at Carrum that we haven't restored any reefs at to date, and we've got a new site in Dramana also. The project is a foundation partnership between, obviously, the TNC, the Victorian Government, and Albert Park Yachting and Angling Club. And since we started in 2015, there's many other groups that have come on as partners and supporters, obviously including the Victorian National Parks Association. Just a quick recap. It's been a staged restoration process. So back in 2013, there was a feasibility study, which was led by the Victorian Fisheries Authority, to look at where the historic reefs used to be on paper. Is it possible to restore reefs, and whether or not there was community support, particularly amongst recreational fishers. And based on the outcomes of this feasibility study, we had a stage 1 pilot trial. Again, involved Victorian Fisheries Authority, TNC, and the University of Melbourne as science partners. And this pilot trial is looking at asking a couple of questions. Do we need to elevate the oysters and mussels off the seabed to facilitate survival and growth? Are the areas that we've chosen for shellfish reef restoration suitable for restoration? And based on the outcomes of the pilot trial, we moved into stage 2 and stage 2 extension, where we have restored 2.5 hectares of reefs. I did have looks like I've missed that slide. I've got another slide coming up in terms of the outcomes. So essentially, we've built 2.5 hectares of reefs. We've seeded those reefs with up to 5 million native oysters from the bay, Australian flat oysters, and about 1.5 million mussels. We've had 600 volunteers engaged in the project, contributing over 3,000 hours, and that's probably not actually counting the individual hours. Folk like Bob Pearce from Albert Park Yachting and Angling Club have committed. Bob on his own has probably committed sort of 2,000 hours. So it's been a real sort of community effort to achieve what we've achieved to date. Before I dive into how we've used the data from, before I dive into the construction that's happening in October, how we've used the data. So one of the key ways we've used the data already is around restoration suitability modelling. It's a modelling process to look at what areas in the bay are highly suitable for shellfish reef restoration. This is a very dense slide, and I've broken all the PowerPoint rules here, but essentially in this model, we look at a number of different parameters, and we've got envelopes and criteria. So for example, you look at one of the parameters is looking at remnant reefs and known areas of high density of oysters. So essentially, we want to build these reefs where we know there are remnant populations of oysters and mussels. We do see these reefs with hatchery-reared oysters, but the closer these reefs are built to those remnant population, the more chance we're going to get natural recruitment. So OysterWatch data and the OysterWatch hotspot locations have been imported into this data model, and essentially that's one of the key parameters in terms of choosing areas that are suitable for the shellfish reef restoration. The other parameters in this model, obviously the bathymetry, substrate. We also put in buffers to existing habitats like seagrass, which is really important at Germana. There's existing seagrass beds. We want to avoid aquaculture zones. We want to avoid any other cultural sensitive areas. We can't build near shipping channels, so we put buffers into that. And I'm just going to show you a few maps now in terms of the outcomes. So this is a map, Werribee offshore from the Melbourne water treatment plant. And as you can see here, the yellow shading shows areas where it's highly suitable to restore shellfish reefs. And as you can see, we've put buffers into the aquaculture zone. We've put buffers in around the port area as well. It's a really interesting case study here. Melbourne Water obviously are treating water, for putting it sort of back into the bay. Melbourne's population base is increasing every year. Melbourne Water may have to upgrade the plant in terms of being able to handle the treatment, the amount of water that goes into that plant. So one scenario is rather than spending millions of dollars to upgrade that plant in order to treat that water, we can also build shellfish reefs in the area. Shellfish reefs are incredibly efficient at filtering water, filtering nitrogen from the water as well. So you could have a dual outcome here. You have the treatment plant that's doing its job. You can also have the shellfish reefs here that can provide that natural water treatment service as well. This is a map from sort of the Bellarine Peninsula, a bit closer home to me. As you can see here, there's a number of areas here that also come up as either highly suitable or suitable for shellfish reef restoration. And then going into areas like Carrum, there's a large patch there that's also suitable for shellfish reef restoration. Essentially, this model is only as good as the data that you input into the model. So we're using a lot of the existing data sets that DELP have, inputting into this data set. Once you do this restoration suitability modeling, you also need to do baseline surveys. You need to ground truth these areas to substantiate the information that the model is providing. And another way in which we use the data from OysterWatch, we're also interested to look at, okay, this area may have a number of remnant population of oysters, but when the oysters spawn, where does that larvae go? So this animation's coming up okay through Zoom. Essentially, this is a model looking at the spawning period between November and February every year. Essentially, when an Angazi oyster releases the larvae, it stays in the water column for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, to get to the next stage of life, it needs to land on something to attach to and grow. If it doesn't land on anything and attach to anything, essentially that larvae will die. So this model is showing basically you've got Frankston, you've got a hotspot of oysters, where will that larvae travel over that 3-month period? So I guess the oysters will have different release periods. So one oyster will release the larvae, it'll travel for 2 weeks. That'll be in November. December, you might have another oyster with reduced larvae, and that will travel also for a 2-week period. So it's a combination of a release from lots of different oysters over that sort of 3-month period. As you can see, the larvae does travel a fair way throughout Port Phillip Bay. And I've got similar maps for the other hotspot areas for OysterWatch, and also maps for the existing reefs in the bay. And here's the slide that I was missing before. And I guess just to recap, I guess the main thing that I didn't highlight then is that whilst we've been building reefs, we've also been recycling a number of different shells through Shuck Don't Chuck shell recycling projects. So to date, we've recycled over 1,000 cubic metres of shells, which is around 275 tonnes, which would have otherwise ended up in landfill. And I've got a photo of the shell recycling site in a moment. So essentially, we're recycling shells from restaurants, seafood wholesalers. We cure and quarantine those shells for 6 months at a site at St Leonard's to kill off any marine pathogens. Then we use those shells to both grow oysters on in the hatchery and also to build shellfish reefs. And I'll go into that process a little bit more in a moment. And we'll see if this video works okay. Is that coming up okay? This is Margaret's Reef. This is one of the first reefs we built. You got a picture of some oysters growing on some limestone there. The first picture that you saw was of a large school of pinky snapper, around 2-year-old. There's some hula fish. There's some urchins. There's the snapper again. You can see after a relatively short period of time, 2.5 years, this is a living, thriving shellfish reef. So the results so far have been really exciting and really promising. Occasionally you do get some introduced species that pop up on the reef, which isn't unexpected, but we are finding that succession over time is the natural species are coming in and sort of dominating that area. So really exciting results really early on from these reefs that are built at Margaret's Reef. There's pufferfish coming through here as well. This footage was taken during winter. Usually the visibility isn't quite as good as this, so if you can brave the cold and get out there and check the reefs, winter is certainly a really good time to do that, and more than happy to supply the locations if you want to dive and take a look. Okay, so moving into stage 3, which is the next stage of shellfish reef restoration. In order to restore reefs in the bay, you need a permit from DELP. So we've secured 3 permits, Margaret's Reef and Wilson Spit, which are the original sites, and I'll show you some maps in a moment, 9-foot Bank and Dramana. So we have permits to build reefs, and these permits allow us to build up to 20 hectares over the 3-year life permit of these. Polaris Marine is the contractor that we've selected after a request for quote process. They're a contractor that have worked on these, that built the reefs that are the 2.5 hectares that are already in Port Phillip Bay. And also, I guess it's important to note as well that the Victorian Fisheries Authority are building fishing reefs at the same time. And we're both using Polaris Marine to deploy and to construct these reefs in October. You also require a works permit through Parks Victoria, and the reason why I was a little bit late to this call, I was chatting to Parks Victoria. That works permit is pending. It's just going through the internal processes at the moment. They're happy with all the information we've supplied. There's just a number of different agencies that need to tick off on that permit. And also part of the MACA permit conditions was to form a technical reference group. So that's been formed. We've had our first meeting. And essentially the membership of that group are the regulators. So there's a representation from DELP, Parks Victoria, Victorian Fisheries Authority, the Catchment Management Authorities, and also membership from the traditional owner groups in the Bay as well. And this replaces a expert working group that's been advising on the group, advising on the project up until now. And also one of the permit conditions is that DELT requested an independent science review of the outcomes of the project to date and also the reef design. Professor Mick Keogh from the University of Melbourne is undertaking that review. We've received the preliminary results from that. Mick is happy with our approach. He's got some feedback in terms of our monitoring evaluation and monitoring evaluation reporting framework. Always find that a bit of a mouthful. But all in all, Mick is supportive of the approach that we've taken to date, but more than happy to release the findings from that independent review publicly when it lands. Like I said, we're postponed. We monitor these reefs annually. We've actually monitored the reefs twice a year for a 3-year period. We're moving into an annual monitoring period. Due to COVID-19, we've postponed that to March, April. We will be, thankfully, I'm getting away from my desk, we will be undertaking some baseline dives of both 9-foot bank and Germana in September, just to basically finalise the exact location of the reefs that we're building. So we have a permit to build the reefs that we go in and we do further baseline dives. We collect before information before we build the reefs and also after information once the reefs are built. We've also been really busy cleaning and bagging shell. I've been doing that in collaboration with VFA. And as you can see, the bottom photo here is that we've been cleaning. We've got about 25 cubic meters of shell to clean. Essentially, we bag these shells up and we settle the oyster larvae on them that grow into spat, and we seed the reefs. I've got some photos of that in a moment. We put the shells through a mussel tumbler, and then we bag up the shells here. So the photo on the left is putting it through the mussel tumbler, spraying it with high pressure hoses, and here's the bagging up process as well. And usually I have lots and lots of volunteers help me out with this process as well, but unfortunately at the moment with the regulations, that's been put on hold. We're also going to be seeding these reefs with blue mussels, and we've got an aquaculture farmer from Advanced Mussel Supplies that are growing out these wild set mussels in the bay at the moment, and there's around 6 tonnes. Okay, in terms of the sites, so essentially one of the original sites, Wilson Spit, you got Clifton Springs is around down here. You got the shipping channel going into Geelong. So that's the 25-hectare Wilson Spit site, and we have built 4 reefs there, 2 oyster reefs and 2 mussel reefs to date, and that's in about 6 meters of water, and that's an old shellfish reef that's now dead and buried. Now, 9-foot bank is a really interesting site. This is the closest we've found to a shellfish reef in the bay. So rather than a consolidated sort of reef base, we have clumps of oysters. Here we go. I'll go back to that photo in a moment. Essentially, we engaged with Deakin University to do some mapping of this site in 2017. So they've mapped this site and they've identified this central 4.25 hectare region as a degraded shellfish reef. So clumping oysters and lots of gaps in between. Next to that, you have seagrass and clumping oysters, and beyond that, you have seagrass. So it's obviously a really sensitive site. We need to be really careful about how we undertake shellfish reef restoration in this area. And this is a photo of a portion of 9-foot bank. So what we're looking to do is strategically and very carefully place recycled shell in between these different clumps. And I guess the theory is this site is only recruitment limited. It's not substrate limited. So what I mean by that is that in other areas of the bay, you need to build a reef base and seed that reef base. Whereas in this area, what we consider is that because there's still a number of living oysters in this area, all we need to do is put down recycled shell at the right time of the year, which is October, because the oysters spawn in November, and create enough substrate for when these oysters spawn, they can land on the shell, and we can develop a consolidated reef base around this area. The other site we have is in Hobson's Bay. Once again, this was an old shellfish reef. Even up to the 1980s, there was living, breathing mussel reefs in this area. We've constructed 2 shellfish reefs here, 2 oyster reefs. And as you can see, the video that we showed earlier, the first reef we built in 2017, the early results are really amazing. It's in 9 meters of water, a little bit deeper than the other sites, and a largely sort of sandy, shelly bottom. Now, Dramana, this is a new site. Let's take a breath for a moment. So our restoration suitability modelling highlighted this site was highly suitable for restoration. So we went in and did some baseline surveys, and the original baseline surveys were around, I don't know if you can see around just below this. I can wait up, I'll just see if I can be, oh, I can't animate, that's okay. I can see this aquaculture zone here. So below that, originally we dived in this area here, and what we picked up obviously was that there was a lot of seagrass beds that were previously unmapped, so they weren't on the DELP biota database. So very quickly through our baseline dives, we realised there's a lot more information about this area that we need to gather before we can consider to restore shellfish reefs. So we engaged Fathom Pacific, they're a consultant, and they did a number of towed video surveys throughout this area. And through those towed video surveys, they identified some previously unmapped seagrass meadows. If you're a fisherman and you live in the area, you probably already knew there's seagrass meadows here, but in terms of the statewide mapping database, it was unknown to this date. So they did a number of towed video surveys right through here. So all those green areas, that was picked up through this for this towed video surveys, and that's gone into the DELP biota database. This central area here was picked up as an old dead and buried shellfish reef, and I've got some photos in a moment. I mean, this whole area could have been shellfish reef at one stage, and maybe the Zostera seagrass has moved in since the 1800s. And the area that we're looking at, that we are going to restore, there's large patches that look like this. So a sandy bottom with lots of evidence of old shellfish reefs. So you've got large sort of Australian Gazi shells here. You've got an old scallop shell. You've got other sort of pippies and types of shells here as well. So basically what we're looking to do is very carefully within this 5 hectare footprint is to restore 1 hectare of shellfish reef within this Dramana area. So we have a 350 metre buffer to the nearest seagrass in this zone here. It's really exciting. It's really exciting to be able to restore shellfish reefs in this area where they used to be. And it's also going to be really exciting considering that shellfish reefs filter the water. They improve the clarity of the water column, whether or not by restoring shellfish reef, that brings back more seagrass. There's plenty of evidence internationally where you put shellfish reefs in, that the seagrass has certainly come back. So we're really excited about this site over time. And how do we construct these reefs? Well, we essentially use a composite of recycled shell and limestone, or just limestone. In terms of Dramana, because it's a more dynamic part of the bay, there's lots of currents. You probably get waves on the beach at certain times of the year. We're gonna build it using a limestone base, and I've got some some brief designs I'll show in a moment. But essentially, this is a photo from a video from Hobson's Bay, Margaret's Reef in 2017. So you have a barge and a long reef excavator. that places, in this case, a 30 metre by 10 metre reef footprint as per the reef design. And as you can see, we had a beautiful weather day. It was flat as a tack out there. So fingers crossed in October we get similar weather. Here's a photo of the shell curing site at St. Leonard's. There is over 500 cubic metres of shells there. We're going to be using a large proportion of these shells building reefs coming up in October. So very quickly, I was just going to go into the reef designs. So this is Geelong, Wilson Spit. Essentially, we're going to build a 30 metre by 10 metre recycled shell base and strategically place, we've upped this a little bit, we're going to do 2 metre clumps of limestone, 10 cubic metre clumps of limestone throughout that base. And I'm going to go into some of the specifics about reef design in a moment also. Geelong is a less dynamic area in terms of currents, so it's certainly an area that's more conducive to using recycled shell. But saying that, we have built reefs at Margaret's Reef at Hobson's Bay out of recycled shell, and we do have the intention of building more recycled shell reefs in the northern part of the bay. However, in the October reef build, we're looking at using limestone in the north. And essentially, I guess this is I guess you're looking at a representation of a 1 hectare patch at Wilson Spit. And this is sort of the type of configuration of how we build these reefs. So we use different size reefs, and I'll go into the reasons for that in a moment. 9-foot bank, which we just talked about. Essentially, we're going to be building a 1 hectare site within this 3.6 hectares, this middle section. So yeah, very carefully and strategically placing recycled shell in this area. So this is quite a really light touch in terms of restoration. And this is what you call, in terms of ecological restoration, this is assisted regeneration, whereas the other types of restoration in terms of ecological restoration is reconstruction. We need to put the reef base back in and also seed those reefs. In terms of reef designs, these are the underlying principles. We need to elevate these bivalves off the bottom in terms of survival and growth. We're using limestone rubble and recycled shell as a settlement substrate and as structure. Essentially, both the limestone and the recycled shell has a calcium content, which is a settlement cue for the oyster larvae and the mussel larvae. And we really customize the substrate and the type of reef to suit the conditions. We orientate the reefs to be perpendicular to the dominant current. And the reason for that is that we want the reefs to, as the currents pass over the reef, we want the oysters and mussels on that reef to have an equal opportunity to feed in terms of the nutrients in that water column. If they're parallel to the dominant current, the risk is that the reefs at the top end receive all the nutrients, and by the time it gets down to the bottom end, there's no nutrients left. And we're also designing these reefs for rugosity and heterogeneity. So essentially, we want difference in height. We don't want the reefs just to be level, and we also want to have lots of sort of hidey holes, lots of crevices for different fish and snapping shrimp for other sort of different species to go into. A natural reef isn't flat, it isn't like a rectangle. So basically we want some, we don't want the reefs to be uniform. We want them to have some habitat complexity to increase the habitat value. And also a really important part of ecological restoration is that we want to restore the reefs as natural state as possible. Unfortunately, there's no reference system or natural reefs in Port Phillip Bay. So in this case, we use a reference model. However, the closest reference reef we have to date is in Tasmania, off the east coast of Tasmania. So what we're doing is we use this as a reference site, and we're basically building the reefs as naturally as possible. The other purpose of a reference site is to set some benchmarks around what is a shellfish reef. So in terms of our benchmarks, 50 adult oysters or mussels per square metre, it's actually probably a bit more for mussels, constitutes a shellfish reef compared to other reefs. And once we've built that reef base, then we go back and we seed these reefs with either mussels or oysters. In this photo here, we have a number of, lots and lots of fish bins with blue mussels. We call this, this apparatus the bivalve blaster. It's like a reverse vacuum cleaner. You put the oysters or mussels in top. It goes down some piping down here. You have some high pressure water here that's then pushing them down that piping. Then you have a commercial diver on the bottom, which has a separate, I guess, a separate type of pipe, the sort of the plumbing typing with the plumbing piping with the ribs in it. So the oysters and mussels are getting pushed through at a high speed, and then essentially sprinkling them over that reef base like sprinkling icing on a cake. It's my 6-year-old birthday tomorrow, so they've been busy doing that out the back. But yeah, so as you can see here, the mussels land on the reef. Mussels are pretty amazing. They actually will move and congregate together, release some byssal threads and sort of clump, whereas the oysters growing on the shells will land on the reef over time, attached to each other, and also attached to either the shells or the limestone. It's the oysters and mussels are the reef-forming species compared to the abalone and scallops. The abalone and scallops will certainly grow together in great abundance, but don't cement together to create a reef and accrete in size over time. And pretty much this is my last slide in terms of ongoing sort of opportunities. There'll certainly be a lot of ongoing volunteer opportunities once these COVID-19 restrictions end. I have a Restore the Bay sort of contact list, which I email people. If you're not on that list, please drop me an email. I'm happy to give you updates around that. We're also developing a statewide plan for shellfish reef restoration, including for the Gippsland region. We also have an Australia-wide effort to restore shellfish reefs, to bring back this ecosystem back from the brink of extinction. So we've got a target of restoring reefs in 60 sites in the next 6 years. And also we'll be looking to move into the sort of coastal resilience project. So I guess simply restoring reefs closer to the shoreline to act as a buffer for erosion, to I guess to dampen that wave energy, a way in which to help combat the ongoing impacts of sea level rise and coastal erosion. In a lot of examples, there's hard coastal engineering that's put in place. Using natural habitats to protect shorelines is also a really important option as well. And I saw some questions jump up on chat there, so more than happy to ask some questions, and I'll check the time. I didn't do too bad for time. So thank you for listening in. I will stop sharing and just looking to see.
Can I say something, Simon?
Of course.
I think the use of it as a erosion thing potentially could be really important, particularly when you showed the map earlier of Edwards Point, New St Leonards, and an area there where a reef could go in. I know when I did the state salt marsh study that Edwards Point was getting hammered, and it seems to have increased since the increased shipping in the channel. But there could be some places like that so with future reef things, can that criteria be one of the criteria too, to protect patches of coastline that are about to fall into the sea?
Oh, that's a really good question. With our restoration suitability modelling, we kind of limited the depth. We said no shallower than 5 metres, but you could definitely extend that out to shallow, because we do know that the oysters and mussels do survive in shallow areas. So yeah, certainly interested in expanding out that restoration suitability modelling to take it closer to the coastline and to look at some options. We have done a first cut around looking at those options as well, and we are actively working in sort of other states in that space as well. But yeah, listen, it's a really good question. The reefs we're building at the moment are quite far offshore, but yeah, certainly interested in moving
I was thinking
into
also
that space.
of the reef off Rosebud that goes down to Capel Sound.
Yeah.
The boats have cut to get through the middle of it, and I think that could have been culturally constructed, you know, a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
Because they used to push the barracuda in there and they come up on the beach. But
Yeah.
if that's something that could be like, if this system works, could be an extension, like we could extend the reef a bit further along and stuff. That sounds like there's a lot of potential here. This is great.
Yeah, I've actually a colleague of mine, Ben Cleven, who's been doing his PhD on this project at the University of Melbourne, has actually spoken about Rosebud. He may have even spoken about that exact location you're talking about as well. So yeah, let's catch up and talk a bit more if you like.
Yeah, it's got some really rare little things in there apparently.
Okay.
Japanese did a lot of stuff to try to stop them put a marina in there years ago. It's mainly nocturnal stuff, but
Yeah.
There's some really interesting things there apparently.
Fantastic. I sort of just got a private message from Darren. More than happy to present for CWW at some stage, and I've got your details there. So thanks very much, Darren. AJ, you had a question.
Yeah, buddy. What's the ultimate goal here? Like, if all the red tape was disappeared for you and we're allowed to actually be awesome humans and go to town on this, what's the ultimate goal? How much area are you going to build?
That's a really good question. Yeah, listen, in terms of red tape, I certainly have found the Victorian government are really keen to collaborate on this project. So I guess it's been a journey in terms of permitting, but I guess in terms of permitting, we'll have permit for the next 3 years for up to 20 hectares, which is a fantastic start. But in terms of recovering this ecosystem in the bay, we have a sort of, at this stage, we have a long-term target of 100 hectares, which would be around 10% of the restorable bottom. So when I say restorable bottom, obviously up to 50% of the bay was once shellfish reefs. You can't put reefs back in all those areas because there's aquaculture zones, there's shipping channels, there's infrastructure. Of what we could put back, 10% of that would be 100 hectares. So that's sort of the long-term aim. But I guess heading into the next couple of years, we'll be looking to restore up to around that 20 hectares. So we've got 3 hectares in there, 2.5 hectares in there at the moment. We're building another 3 hectares in October. I'll be looking to sort of expand that out to that 20 hectares in the next few years. I guess ideally what we want to do in the future is, all you got to do is put down some reef base, and we've rebuilt the natural population base of the oysters and mussels. So you don't need to seed those reefs. There's enough larvae swimming around the common. They naturally colonise those reefs and they build reefs naturally. So that's what we really want to do, is rebuild that natural population base of those oysters and mussels, is one of the key objectives of the project. So all you got to do is put out some substrate.
I think we've got a hand up from Nick.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering, might be a daft question, but are you getting sea urchins into these reefs?
Yeah, Margaret's Reef, you might have, from the video, there's some urchins moving in there. We haven't had any sea urchins at a density that has been an issue at all. The more grazers that move into those reefs, the better urchins, abalone. What we do find is that when we put I guess it's really important to build these reefs close to when the wild populations of oysters and mussels are spawning, but not too soon. If we put them in June, what happens is that we get a lot of sediment and turfing algae on top of that reef base, which then minimises the amount of area that you can get natural recruitment. So having urchins and abalones and those types of grazing species will certainly help. So we are getting some urchins moving in, to answer your question.
All right, and Simon, I think there's a question in terms of shell quality. Are all shells made equal?
Are shells made equal? I'll refer back to sort of Ben Cleveland as part of his research project. He looked at the settlement preference of the oyster larvae. So we compared scallop shells to oyster shells to limestone, and in fact the oysters prefer scallop shells over the oyster shells. So I guess in terms of that natural process, that probably not all created equally. In terms of creating a settlement substrate out in the bay and some habitat complexity, all the shells are good. We don't use abalone shells at this stage. That's based on sort of recommendations from the aquaculture people at Victorian Fisheries Authority. And also recently there was a nationwide risk assessment done on using shells for this purpose. And whilst abalone shells didn't come up as a huge risk, there's still an outside risk there with using abalone shells. So we're using scallop shells, oyster shells and mussel shells. And as I said, we cure and quarantine those shells for 6 months. Jeff, yes.
Oh, hi, Simon. Firstly, I'm not sure if my microphone is working.
It's working. It's good.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thanks, Nicole, and thanks, Simon, for your presentation. I watch with your great interest with this project, how it's evolving, and I watch with great interest for our special watch on Western Port. I guess in terms of what I see of some of the exciting work that you're doing, one, I guess, rather basic question is, do these reef restorations, and maybe there's some worldwide experience here, do they work successfully in areas that have very fast and very high tide flows?
Listen, that's a really good question, and I guess the answer is yes. However, I guess a lot will go into choosing the sites and the reef design also. We're building reefs in Noosa estuary. It's quite a constrained estuary. It does have high tidal movement. It also has a lot of boating traffic as well. So it's interesting because in terms of that historical oyster fishery, Western Port was really the epicenter for it. There was a lot less in Port Phillip Bay. So if anything, there was a lot more oyster reefs in Western Port than was in Port Phillip Bay and in Corner Inlet. So we have done a first cut of site selection in Western Port through the restoration suitability modelling. Happy to share that with you, Jeff. I guess we still need to do a lot of baseline surveys in the bay, and also the mapping from Western Port's quite old as well. So we were relying on sort of quite old habitat mapping in Western Port, but we have done a first cut. There's areas, for example, the ocean side of French Island, that we know that up until the 80s there was an oyster reef there. We think that area there would be suitable for restoration. But yeah, I think that with some with a pilot project at a meaningful size, and based on the results of that, we could roll out a restoration program throughout Western Port. And something else that excites me about Western Port is doing combining oyster reef restoration and seagrass restoration. Obviously, there's some efforts happening there at the moment. We know that oyster reefs help improve the water quality. And just sort of, obviously you can see I'm passionate about Western Port as well, but I know that when they drained the upper catchments, that not only did a lot of the seagrass beds disappear, but the remaining oyster reefs disappeared as well around that same time. So we kind of think there's a correlation between the oyster reefs dying off, then contributing to the seagrass sort of dying off as well. So, yeah. Let's jump on another Zoom call and I can sort of go through the early results for Western Port if you like. Is there another question here? There are reef oysters on the eastern French Island, I think, or they. Oh, okay. Yeah, Western Port. There are Pacific oysters in Western Port. I had someone from the CMA contact me about a site recently and sent me some photos, which were. It was an intertidal photo, so I already suspected that it would have been a Pacific oyster, and it was. Talking of that, the VMPA and TNC have developed an oyster ID sheet, which compares the differences between Angazi oysters and Pacific oysters. So it's like a field guide for practitioners and community members to be able to tell the difference between Angazi oysters and Pacific. So in terms of that site at French Island, I'd have to see some photos and go and take a look. But if the oysters are surviving intertidally, particularly during summer, more than likely they're Pacific. But please send through some photos and we can have a crack at IDing them. Got another question here. You mentioned other shellfish reef restoration processes. Do you have any for subtidal that are not Angazi? We have, not for Angazi, we're doing some intertidal Sydney Rock oyster reefs in Noosa Estuary. Obviously, we're doing the blue mussel reefs in Port Phillip Bay also, and mixed oyster and mussel reefs, and we're doing some mussel reefs in Peel Harbour in Swan Estuaries in WA. But in terms of Australia, it's the Oyster Angazi subtidally that we're targeting at this stage. All right. Any other questions? Doesn't look like it. Well, it's fast approaching dinner time. I definitely appreciate everyone jumping on board. Certainly like to thank Victoria National Parks Association for leading the on ground or on water delivery of OysterWatch. We certainly have an intention of continuing it in 2021 and supporting groups to do that. And very excited about building reefs in October. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to reach out to either Nicole, myself, or Cade.
Thanks, Simon. And again, I just wanted to say thanks to all of the groups who are involved in OysterWatch. So just going through that, it's marine care groups of Ricketts Point, Point Cook, Jawbone Marine Sanctuary, looking at Dive to You, Dive Line, Academy of Scuba, Australian Diving Instruction, and the Disabled Divers Association. I hope I got everybody. If I missed you, very, very sorry. But thanks everybody for your hard work over the last couple of years. It has been fantastic working with you. It would be great to keep an ear out and make sure that we can continue the conversation and potentially look at more OysterWatch in years that aren't 2020. So thanks for coming.